Hey guys, here in Matthew 16, looking at is the church built upon Peter, because his name was Rock, right? Look at this, Peter's confession. Jesus came to the coast of Caesarea Philippi, and he asked his disciples, they're all there, by the way, saying, "Who do you say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And they said, "Thou art the..." Some say you're the Baptist, John the Baptist, some Elias, others Jeremias, and or one of the prophets. He said, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "Well, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." So the disciples are standing around. He says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, Peter's the one to answer. Okay? Peter says, You are the Christ, Son of the living God. And Jesus said unto him, "Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven." So let's stop right there, because this next verse is the key. If I don't know, if James had said that, he would have said, "Blessed art thou, James, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven," right? Any of the disciples had answered, but Peter happened to answer, okay? So Jesus takes Peter, because God knew it would be Peter to answer, and then he says unto them, "I say unto thee, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So Catholics, I think, use this as the reasoning that Peter is like the Pope figure. It's his lineage, and that's how the Catholic Church is built. Except for there's a problem here. So he says that, and he says, "And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter." Well, he just asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" They said, "Well, you're the Christ." And he said, "Yes, and blessed are you, for you said it. Now, you are Peter." Why? Because Peter's the one that answered him. So he talks to Peter. If it was James, he would have talked to James. But see, this matters because it says, "You are Peter." By the way, Peter is Petros. It's masculine. It's proper noun. Okay? And it means, apparently, a primary word, a rock or a piece of a rock. Okay? Petrus. Either way, it's an apostle. Peter. Rock. We can all agree that his name means rock. It's a proper masculine noun, right? So let's go back. So he's looking at who? Just Peter? No, he's looking at everybody. It just happened to be Peter that answers, and he answers back, and your name is Peter. And upon this rock, did he say Petros? Because if he was talking about Peter, he would have said Petros. He would have touched him, maybe, pointed to him, or whatever, but he's talking to who? He's talking to everybody, all his disciples, of whom he's going to send out to share the gospel about himself. And he says, "Upon this rock," Petra. It's feminine, and it's a noun. It's not masculine. Now, it also means rock. So if he was talking about Peter, he would have said Petros. But he wasn't talking about Peter. He was talking about the flock, the church, right? Of whom the body of Christ, Christ is the head of the church, right? And by the way, the church is the bride of Christ. It's feminine. So he is talking about everybody around who's with him. So imagine this. Petra is feminine noun, and Petros is proper, all right, masculine. So the two words rock and rock are not the same. They are different. They are distinct, and you have to know the difference to understand that while he is talking to Peter, because it's Peter talking who answered him. By the way, the first question was, "Who do you say that I am?" "Well, you are the Christ." And he says, "You are a rock. And it's upon this rock," and you can either see him pointing to himself or his hand swirling around to all the disciples, right? The bride of Christ, the feminine bride of Christ, "that I will build my church." However, we know that Jesus is the chief cornerstone, and so he was probably pointing to himself. Okay? Now, that's very interesting because if you think about it, to say that it's Peter, why would he change those? Why does it all change? He obviously was not talking about Peter, because he just called him his name, and then he gave a completely different. It's almost like a play on words. Your name is Petros, but it's upon this, Petra, that I will build my church. Do you see? So it's minor, but it matters, and it completely disqualifies Peter from being the head of the church, or the only head of the church. It was and by the way, he's not talking just to Peter. He's talking, they're gathered round. If you go back to the scriptures, right here, who's he with? Right here. And he asked his disciples, they're all there. But who's the big mouth that answers? On cue, it's supposed to be Peter. Why? Because he's going to use Peter and his name and go, look, but it's not you, Petros, it's this Petras. It's me. It's the church of which I'm building that I will, sorry, my mind just went blank. Thou art Peter, upon this rock that I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Do you think the gates of hell are going to prevail against Peter? Yes. In fact, he fails him 3 times. And yes, he ends up dying for him, and that's great. And I can't wait to meet him one day in heaven. But then charged he his disciples that they should tell no man that he was Jesus the Christ. Oh, it says, and I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth, I shall be bound in heaven. And one more thing. He also says, and I will build my church. All right. So he says, and that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. So Jesus is saying that Jesus will build Jesus's church upon a big-mouth Jewish fisherman. No, just because his name's Rock. If that were the case, he would have said Petros, but he said Petra. Okay? By the way, Petra has a significant usage in the scriptures. Okay, so looking here at the word Petra and rock, here's a great scripture. And did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of the spiritual rock, Petra, that followed them. And that rock, or Petra, was Christ. So we know Jesus is the chief cornerstone of the faith. He is the one of which is spoken of even in the Old Testament. The rock which Moses hit and split and gave them water. So Jesus is the rock. He is the Petra. So you can see now with that being there. Let me go back here. This is the rock, the Petra. All right. I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevent. So once again, it says this is the rock. It's Petra. Okay. So rock is mentioned. Let's see here. It says here, Jesus, blah, blah, blah. Jesus said unto him, you are rock, and upon this rock, it's a different rock, I will build my church, and the gates will not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom. So did he give the keys of the kingdom to Peter? Who's he talking to? He's talking to who? His disciples. He asked his disciples. He's discipling as they speak. So I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock, probably pointing to himself. And he says, thou art Peter. Why? Because you just said, I'm the Christ. I'm the Christ. You were rock. And upon this rock, pointing to himself. Remember, the context is all about Jesus being the head of the church, building his church. Why? Because it says next, And it says next, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. You think it's because of Peter. No, it's not. I will give unto thee, you all, the keys of the kingdom. He's talking to everybody here. And whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then he charged who? Peter? No, he charged his disciples that they should tell no man that he was Jesus the Christ. So he is not just talking to Peter and using Peter. Now he is using Peter's name as a play on words. You are Petros, and I am Petra. All right? So, anyway, I'm just throwing this out there because it's something I'm kind of mulling over. I've been thinking about this and how with the Catholic Church, I know that the Catholic Church believes that Peter is the lineage, he's the initial starting point for that. But that's not necessarily true. In fact, let me show you something else.
For now, however, we're going to stay in Europe and continue our journey through time there. After the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD at the hands of Germanic barbarians, Europe entered the Dark Ages. The Catholic Church stepped into the power vacuum that had been created by the collapse of the Roman Empire, and it quickly became the most powerful spiritual and political entity in the world. In the 8th century AD, a forged document was created called the Donation of Constantine. It stated that Constantine had bequeathed the Roman Empire to the Catholic popes, and although it was found to be fraudulent in the 15th century, by then its work had already been accomplished. Legal authority over the kings of Europe was already in the hands of the Pope and the Catholic Church. It took a while to secure the new system in Europe, though. In the 7th century, the Pope went looking for a protector to defend Catholic territories. Pepin, the leader of the Franks, was chosen, and he was bribed with a promise that if he cooperated in this mission, his place in heaven would be secured. Battles ensued for a while, but it wasn't until Charlemagne, Pepin's son, that the Pope's security was truly assured. Charlemagne was then crowned in Rome on the 25th of December 800 AD as the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was seen to be a continuation of the old collapsed Imperial Roman Empire. This move shrewdly promoted popes to kingmakers, who claimed their authority to do so because of the forged Donation of Constantine and because of their connection to God. Later, the Catholic historian Tertullian wrote of that transaction that our God no longer reigns, he has resigned all power over to the Pope. At the command of the Pope, Charlemagne went forth on many campaigns of conquest throughout Europe. All conquered lands and people came under the authority of the Catholic Church, and Europe was united under their reign. Consequently, Charlemagne is now considered the father of Europe. The Catholic rule, however, although unified, was a dark, dark period in history. Anyone who did not willingly submit to the authority of the Church was persecuted and killed for heresy. European citizens were taxed heavily and were expected to spend their lives in the service of the Church. With worldly power, corruption kept growing. Pope Leo X began the process of selling indulgences as a way to extort money from the people. This means that he offered forgiveness of sins for a fairly small amount of money. For a little bit more money, you would not only be forgiven of a sin, but you would be allowed to carry on indulging in it. Hence the name, selling of indulgences. Also, through the invention of purgatory, you can now purchase the salvation of your loved ones' souls in the Catholic system. The Church taught the ignorant masses, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the troubled soul from purgatory springs. Pope Leo X showed his true feelings when he said, "The fable of Christ has been quite profitable to us." As a result of such corrupt behavior, the Church became exceedingly rich. They played on fear to control and dominate, and increased their wealth in the process. Before long, the Church dominated the political and cultural landscape. It was the most powerful institution in the world, and the Pope the most powerful man. The Pope became the real spiritual authority behind the rulers of the world, and he used religious persuasion to control nations for his own purposes. If kings acted against the wishes of the Vatican, the Pope could excommunicate them from the Church, and therefore effectively sentence them to eternity in hell. This fear was enough to keep the kings of Europe in line with the Church's wishes. Once more we see that religious authority secures temporal authority. The Church also recognized a key principle to maintaining power: control knowledge. Knowledge really is power, and so with this in mind it endeavored to block all independent learning and scientific progress. In this way the people would be forced to depend on the Church's hierarchy for information, and the dependency would consolidate the Church's power. This is primarily why the era has become known as the Dark Ages. In 500 AD, for example, the Bible was available in 500 languages. By 600 AD, the Catholic Church had restricted it to just one language, and that was Latin. Latin was already a dead language by this time, understood only by priests. In this respect, people became utterly reliant on the Catholic Church for information and knowledge about God. If the Catholic Church said something, people had no choice but to believe it and to act accordingly, because they had no direct access to the Bible themselves. By keeping the population in ignorance and dependent on their instructions, the Church hierarchy could play them like puppets. This deliberate construction of a knowledge-based hierarchy is an occult trait. As Martha Acklesberg said, "Hierarchies make some people dependent on others, blame the dependent for their dependency, and then use that dependency as a justification for further exercise of authority." Throughout the Dark Ages, the corruption kept growing. Mary became more and more prominent, as did praying to and devoting yourself to saints, the idea of sacraments, mandatory celibacy, monasticism, and the idea that the Pope was nothing less than infallible and God on earth. The Holy Roman Empire became a cesspool of depravity and corruption, like the Imperial Roman Empire had been.